Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell for Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com and follow us up on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this is made possible by our sponsors, OWC. For more information on how they can assist you in your filmmaking needs, go to owcdigital.com. This week, I'm joined by Mark Russell, visual effects supervisor, whose work includes Carriers, Doubt, American Ultra, among many, many other films, including the recent In the Heights. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I guess my first question is, we already slightly discussed it, but you were involved with removing the guns in ET and putting in the walkie-talkies. Can you tell me about that situation?
Yes, I was. It was pretty early in my career. I was working in the Spielberg world, and the 20th anniversary of ET had sort of emerged on us, and it was right around the time that George Lucas had put out the remastered Star Wars movies, to huge fanfare and lots of success, and where he replaced a lot of the practical effects with animated characters, and Jabba the Hutt was walking in a scene that they never were able to finish in the past. And I think there was a desire to reintroduce ET to a new audience 20 years later. And part of the reason to do that is to include some new things and to change it. And I think retrospectively, Steven Spielberg looked back and thought that having the feds holding guns in front of the kids, essentially a bunch of preteens or teens on bikes with the feds holding shotguns in front of them, just didn't make a lot of sense in today's world, or at least in the world of 2000 when we were doing this, 1998, 1999. And so we explored a lot of things. One of the things that got the most attention was the fact that we put walkie-talkies in their hands instead of guns. And the idea was looking back and being like, well, maybe this is an unnecessary symbol of violence in our society that we can get rid of in our little way. And I think the backlash of it was pretty entertaining, for one, but I think it was maybe not the most well thought out idea going in. But the outrage over it, I think, was a little overblown. But yes, we did replace the guns with walkie-talkies. There was I think one guy still with a shotgun, but all the other officers surrounding them had walkies in their hands instead of guns.
Yeah.
Because it looked pretty silly when you come back, 20 years later and realize that these big, scary federal agents are all holding guns on these kids on bikes. Yeah. So I think the intention behind it was good, but it didn't sit well with a lot of the big fans of the movie.
And that's pretty early in VFX still. Like, we're still in that transition to digital in a lot of cases. So were you guys just like, was it just photoshopping each individual frame? Like, what was the process for?
No, I mean, ILM did the work. I was on the production side, but it was at a time when we were replacing a lot of the original practical effects with CG as well. So sure, it was still, late 90s, early 2000s, but I think we used CG guns at the time. Because we were doing a lot of digital stuff with the spaceship, and there was an animated ET that we put in a number of scenes where it was practical before. So, in addition to doing the guns, we basically cleaned up a lot of the things that had always bothered Steven in the past. And we explored reinserting a few scenes that were omitted from the original film. At the end of the day, I don't know if any of them ever made it back. I think they may have come out as special features on the DVD. But there were some really interesting scenes that, for obvious reasons at the end of the day, didn't make it into the original cut of the movie. And when you see them in their context, they either don't move the story forward enough, or they were tonally a little bit off from what ended up becoming the final film. So I think that for me, it was an amazing process to kind of watch a movie that I grew up on as a child. I mean, I think it was 8 when ET came out, somewhere in the 7-8 zone, to have an inside look into not only how the movie was made, but choices that were made when the film came out, or when the film was initially being cut, that still held up. And the reasons that they made those choices when they did were all incredibly strong. And so you see these really great scenes that still had no place in the movie. It was a fascinating experience for me, and it taught me a lot.
Now, you also, you worked on some iconic projects. Like, I think about Hellboy, I think about Carriers, and these both have a lot of practical effects. As a VFX supervisor now, how do you like to approach films in terms of practical versus VFX? Do you like to try and find a blend, or what's your approach?
I think a lot of how I've built my career has been doing films where the effects are invisible, might be a bit of an overstatement, but are less visible than they are in some of the movies that come out today. I think I'm drawn toward projects where the effects are critical and essential and very important to telling the story, but are not front and center in your face. When you walk away, you don't think these effects were great. You think this movie was great, is what I'm always going for. And for me, that comes back to my roots, which, the first big film that I worked on was Jurassic Park 2.
Mm-hmm.
And what I learned from that and from the Jurassic Park series, which, love it or hate it, amazing technological feats, these movies. And Jurassic Park is still like the movie that I can recall that really drove effects into modern visual effects, what we deal with today. And when you look back at it, the movie only has 66 visual effects shots in it,
mm-hmm.
top to bottom, 66 shots. Indie films have more than that now. So to think that they can make a movie where you walk away thinking, holy crap, there are dinosaurs with only 66 visual effects shots. To me, that's the gold standard. You want to be able to use old techniques and practical filmmaking wherever you can. Even if you're shooting visual effects elements, I think you want to use real things as much as possible. Obviously, there are things that you can't do that with. If you can't shoot Hogwarts Castle, for example, or things that are just not possible to do for safety reasons, they have to be visual effects. Everything else, I think you have to look at it first with the idea of how would you shoot this if it were real? And how would you shoot it real if you can? And even if you can do pieces of it, I think it really helps contribute and create something that the audience feels connected to and doesn't feel is an added piece. And I think that's always the goal for me, is to find things that feel integrated and feel realistic in the way they're being told. So even if you're shooting something that is completely fantastical, I think you always have to step back and go, if I was a cinematographer, how would I be shooting this? How do we make this feel like the language that everybody is used to in the film already? And that changes project to project. Every movie is a little different, or every TV show is different on how they use the language. And I think you really have to integrate the visual effects into that methodology in order for it to appear seamless.
Well, it's interesting because Jurassic Park, like you said, there's so few visual effects shots. And even like when they find the Triceratops, I believe it was like two guys underneath there pushing the thing up.
Yep.
So, there's this nice balance in that series, and it holds up. It is just mind-blowing when you rewatch it and you're like, that doesn't feel like it's 1994 or 3 or whenever it came out. You also you sort of mentioned like trying to get that blend, but budgets can also play a huge role in determining that. So when you get a budget, how do you determine where you're going to be like, this will be practical, this will be VFX? Because I think about like your example of Hogwarts, it'd be like, oh, we could shoot a miniature and then add some things to make it look but then we're shooting film or getting crews in here. And so how do you
and something, I think something like a Hogwarts, where throughout a series of 8 films you're going to see every possible part of it, doesn't make sense to build that practically. And especially with the giant fly-throughs and all the interactive explosions and that kind of stuff. I think for me, it's interesting because I've worked in New York for such a long time now, and I really believe, not to place any kind of judgment on it, but I think the movies that come and the shows that come out of New York are very different than the shows that come out of LA or Atlanta or London or Vancouver, or Toronto, or Montreal, in that most of the filmmakers who come through New York, whether that's the directors or the producers that they're working with, came from a world where it was about getting the material in the can first.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all about what you can capture on film within the city and within the resources that you had. And I think that's very different from an approach standpoint than larger effects films that are generally based on stage, whereas we don't do as much stage work in the city, in that you plan a lot more, at least on the visual effects side, about the small pieces that you can put together to do things. Whereas the films that come out of New York, and the ones that I tend to work on, and very long way to get to my point here, is that the films that I tend to work on, which mostly come out of New York, tend to be more based in reality and practicality than things that are fantastical. They have fantastical elements and they have pieces that require that. So for me, it always comes down to identifying the things that you can shoot in camera first, and then the ones that you can't. And then once you start prep, becomes a conversation with the production designer and the director and the cinematographer about maybe, sure, we could build this, but it makes less sense to build this because we're only in it for a certain amount of time, or because it's a physical location that we only have access to, or we can't get access to the right way. So then you have to answer those problems about how do you solve production oriented solutions about things you can't shoot, or how to make things work in a way that integrates with the production but gets you the best storytelling possible. So it's a challenge, but I think the first thing you do is you read a script and you look at it and you go, how would I do this? Knowing what I know about who the director is and the production limitations and sometimes the budget, oftentimes I'll read a script knowing what the parameters of at least the visual effects budget are hoping to be. I think with visual effects, it's always it's a fun game because, and I say fun in jest partially, because there's a lot of speculation in what the costs of visual effects are. And when you go from a scripted page to dealing with captured footage, it's hard to know exactly how that footage is going to be captured in order to estimate what the costs are going to be. So a lot of it has come down to history and experience, and knowing what I've seen, and knowing that if I read a script that feels a certain way, that I can estimate there are going to be a certain number of shots in the scene in order to tell that part of the story. So upon reading an initial script, it's a process for me of figuring out, largely by blocks, by a scene block of, we're doing some driving comps here. I think this is going to be about 30 shots, versus we're going to do an entire environment here, which is going to be, it's 2 pages. So maybe it's 14 shots, or maybe it's 20, depending on how it's going to be edited. And I think it's a combination of kind of combining all of those different ideas into a guesstimate of what we think is going to happen. And from that process, it becomes about refining and working with the filmmakers and figuring out, yes, we're going to do it this way here, but no, we're going to do it differently here, and kind of adjusting as you go. I know I meandered all over the place there, but no, I hope that's helpful.
One of the questions, so whenever I talk to cinematographers, I'm like, what was a difficult shot to get or what have you. But with VFX, I want to know, what was the shot that was the most fun to do? Because you can do, little touches here and there, but then there's also these fun sort of fantastical scenes you have to create. So what is the scene that you found most fun to do?
Well, I think certainly the one that's forefront in my mind right now is from In the Heights. We have this crazy dance number at the beginning of the third act with Nina and Benny, is sort of the younger couple in the story. And it's this song about, summer's coming and summer's ending, and they want to have, it's the beginning of the summer. They want to have the rest of the summer to kind of enjoy their time together before she goes back to college. And it's this beautiful love song. It's about 3 minutes long. And John Chu, the director, wanted to do something spectacular. So he was sort of thinking Fred Astaire, the spinning room and the grand wedding and the royal wedding. And so we looked at a lot of that kind of reference, and we basically figured out how we wanted to shoot this scene that starts with a very long Technicrane shot with this couple standing on a balcony as their gravity, the world that they live in, their gravity shifts together. So their gravity changes versus the rest of the world. And we wanted to figure out a way to show that in camera. And we figured out that the best way to do it was to hold this shot as long as humanly possible, and to do this whole transition from them standing up normal, having a conversation, and then turn everybody's world on its side, and to try and do it in a single take. And to me, that was, in my recent memory, that was sort of the most exciting thing that we've done, in that it had so many different layers of technical expertise in order to make it happen. Like the camera had to move in the right way, and the choreography had to emphasize a shift in gravity in a way that made it feel natural and yet fantastical at the same time. The set had to be built to a specific specification. And then on top of it all, the visual effects had to be perfect. in order to sell this change without the audience knowing that we're doing something.
Mhm.
And I think for me, it was a year. It was almost 2 years from start to finish, because we were about to finish the movie right in the middle of the pandemic, so we
Mhm.
stretched that out a long time afterward. The movie didn't come out until just recently, but top to bottom, it was like the first scene that we talked about, and it was the last scene that we finished. So for me, it was this crazy moment, and it was really the reason that I wanted to do that film, because
Mhm.
the movie's beautiful and has a lot of really special magical visual effects moments in it, but this one set piece was really the kicker for me. It was the thing that kind of lit my imagination on fire.
Now, you worked with Rob Legato on The Wolf of Wall Street,
I did.
and one of the things he does when I talk to him is he does a lot of stuff himself. So like he will open up Resolve and do color correction to tweak something, or he will go and throw a spaceship out of a plane to get a photo or a shot. Is that something you yourself approach, or how do you are you more hands off and letting the VFX artists?
No, I think I absolutely like to approach things that way. I think there's something about a lot of the people who are drawn toward visual effects that comes from a we have to figure it out kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we all enter into a situation with the expectation of we're going to get whatever we get from the production, and then we're going to have to make the rest of it. And I think that desire to make things sort of perfect oftentimes forces us to do it by ourselves, because we're all a bit of egocentric maniacs, and that we think our way is the right way and that nobody else can do it the same way that we would. So I think you have to kind of get in and get your hands dirty on some level. And I think a lot of what I learned from Rob was that you really have to take command of it. And Rob, he's a really, really smart guy, and he's really, really visual, and he likes to get in there and he likes to sort of manipulate and to shape things himself. And I think there's a real power in that, especially in that part of my job. The biggest part of my job, I think, is communicating what I want to other people. So you have to understand how to get what you want first, I think, in order to be good at it, rather than just telling people, oh, this isn't working. You have to be able to communicate to them why it's not working and what they need to change in order to make it better. I don't necessarily know how to change it and how to make it better, but I can identify what's wrong with it and point them in the right direction. I know enough to know how to tell them what I need to be done in order to make it happen. And there's also a part of me that really likes to get in there and do the work. What I've learned over the time is I like to take things to that sort of temp layout place. I like to take them to the place where everything's in the right places, but the edges are all very rough. I don't have the patience to kind of deal with the fine tuning of things. I get very frustrated if I have to spend too much time on any one thing.
Yeah.
But I think there's definitely something to getting in and getting your hands dirty and manipulating things yourself. And it's a very funny business in that in visual effects, we, a lot like other departments, but I think more so than most other production departments, we touch most aspects of the film. From we deal with the directors, we deal with the cinematographers, we deal with props, we deal with production design, we deal with wardrobe, we deal with hair and makeup, we deal with editing, we deal with color. And we're one of the few departments that really starts at the beginning and finishes at the very end. So we become the through line a lot of the time for the directors and for the producers, in that we were there at the beginning and we know what was intended along each step of the way. So I think that allows us an amazing amount of access to the process and to an understanding for what the goals are. And I think oftentimes we're also the people who have the resources to do lots of different things at the same time, whereas editors have to deal with the material that they were given. Cinematographers have to deal with what's physically on the set. We have this weird, uncanny valley where we can create things that we don't have. So I think having the ability to touch into all of those different departments is really helpful. It's also great to be able to lean on those departments when we need to. But I certainly understand the idea, like, we will, in visual effects, when you get two plates that don't look the same, you have to color correct them in order to balance so that you can integrate one into the other. And if we had to rely on a finishing house to do that with every shot that we did, it would just be impossible. It's just too much back and forth. And when they change color, everything else changes. So it becomes a necessity for us to be able to do it as well.
So where do you go for inspiration?
Mhm. Depends often on the job itself. Another thing that I like to look for in jobs are things that take me outside of my comfort zone. In the Heights, in particular, story about, the barrio of Washington Heights. I didn't know very much about it before I started. I knew physically where it was, and that was about it. So for a job like that, I absorbed as much, excuse me, as much resource and reference that I could get from the art department and from the director, and from my own research as well. I did a lot of digging, and a lot of it for me comes from artwork, comes from photography. Certainly other movies I think are great inspiration. But I like to spend the first couple weeks of prep just sort of saturating myself in the vibe. So I'll spend as much time as I can in the art department early on, kind of absorbing all of the research that they've already done, trying to take advantage of that. And then from there, I'll usually find my own bits and pieces. The TV series I'm working on right now is period Chicago. So it takes place between 1998 and present day. So I've kind of saturated myself with Chicago imagery and trying to get my head into that world.
In the 1990s.
In the 1990s, exactly. Yeah, I traveled back in time, and
you have to get really baggy jeans and
yeah, exactly. But every job is different. I'm trying to think of what would be sort of outside the realm. I did Synecdoche, New York with Charlie Kaufman, and it was this crazy experience working with him. And he's just such a smart person and so brilliantly layered in everything that he's written, that for that one, it was just about reading it again and again and again. And every time I read the script, there was new understanding that came to mind. And I don't pretend to ever be able to understand what's going through his head, but to be able to touch a piece of that was so important to me on that one.
To hold on and enjoy the ride, I guess.
Yeah, and and learn as much as you can from these people who everybody comes with their own history and their own background.
Now, I have one last question I like to ask everyone I interview. We've been stuck in this pandemic for quite a while, and depending on where you are in the world, you go in and out of quarantine. Is there a show or a movie you've discovered on streaming networks that people should check out?
There are a lot, actually. I did a few things during the pandemic. One, I had never watched Game of Thrones. And I feel like as a visual effects person, it's sort of required reading. And I'd been avoiding it for a long time. And then I ended up working with one of the directors from the show. So I wanted to catch up and do that. So I watched Game of Thrones. I'm not saying that's not the one that, I loved it. It was great, but it's not the one the discovery that I would recommend. What I've really discovered is that I really like mysteries in a way that I didn't expect. I think it started watching, now I can't even remember the name of it. Netflix series with Olivia Campbell and Broadchurch.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. Broadchurch, which was awesome. And then from there, it was Lupin on Netflix as well. And I found that these stories that kind of left you with cliffhangers at the end were great during the pandemic because it made you just want to keep watching. So I allowed myself to continue and to binge stuff that I wasn't able to do before.
Well, thank you so much for letting us interview you today.
It was my pleasure. Anytime.
And that's it for this week. Make sure to check out filmmakeru.com and also our Twitter at filmmaker_u. Again, I want to thank you, Mark, for joining us. And of course, our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.